So this will be the first video in um, a class that I'll do kind of as a trial to see what it's like to make a semi-formal class on a video platform. I'm not going to put this anywhere where people could actually pay for it because it's not going to be quite as formal as something like that. And since it's the first one I'm doing, probably not as high quality. But um, but yeah, so the subject of the series will be the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism, which, if you haven't heard of, is it's the source of the quote that life is suffering, which is an oversimplification. Of course, I think everything is oversimplified these days, but it's it essentially starts by saying life is suffering, and the final noble truth is describing how to escape that suffering. But I think it will work well as a class because it's four noble truths and each one builds on the previous one. So um, that's kind of how I distinguish between just normal videos and a proper like series like this will be the third and fourth video won't make as much sense if you haven't seen the first two, that type of thing. But yeah, it is very cold and rainy day, and it seems like a perfect day to talk about the first noble truth, which is the truth that there is suffering, and in other terms, that life is suffering. But I think it's important to distinguish between these two things because the real core of the meaning of this first noble truth is not to say that all of life is suffering, because everything you experience, each individual thing, not all of those are suffering. It's more saying that throughout a person's life, the presence of suffering is something that is unavoidable. And I think so that's sort of the basic level of it, where it's saying that there is suffering, there are unpleasant sensations in the world. And the other level of it, which gets into the historical context of Buddhism and these noble truths that were first they were originally described all thousands of years ago. It was given in a context where there were a lot of different spiritual ideologies, spiritual teachings that were going around, and there were some that attempted to describe the world by saying that there was no suffering and presenting a view of things that said that everything was good and everything was already fine. And I think it's a pretty common thing these days as well, that people people want to think that everything is all right and that there is no trouble with anything. And while this is true for someone who is already liberated, someone who is already free from suffering, for people who are not liberated, it it is true only some of the time. Things are good sometimes, but things are not always good. And while you can live well enough thinking that there is no suffering, and essentially ignoring this noble truth, as the Buddhists would say, you can live a life like that, but you'll always be ignoring some part of your life. And that part of the life that you're ignoring when you say that everything is good, that is the part that is suffering. And it's the way I see it is that the goal of Buddhism, and essentially the reason it's useful for people, is because it doesn't hide from that suffering that we experience. And while there are plenty of parts of Buddhism that describe how to enjoy life, really the reason Buddhism has stuck around so long is because it both recognizes that there is suffering in the world and in people's lives, but it also provides methods and strategies to actually leave that suffering behind rather than simply ignoring it. Mm. And yeah, so yeah, that sort of gives you an idea of what I guess what the purpose of this is, why I'm gonna spend 4 videos talking about suffering when you could just as easily say there is no suffering and live a life that is good enough or whatever. It's not a life that won't lead you to liberation, but will also allow you to not experience the suffering that comes with, or not the suffering necessarily, but experience the kind of the rude awakening that the um, the understanding of suffering brings you. But yeah, to get into the actual description of the first noble truth, it is can be defined more specifically by saying suffering is to be separated from that which you love and to be to be close to that which you hate. The little more black and white way of saying it, I guess, is to not have what you do desire and to have what you do not desire. And and yeah, on some level, this is a very easy thing to understand because we experience this all the time that we're hungry or we're cold or we're tired and we want food and we want warmth and we want to sleep, or we dislike the cold and we I don't know, maybe in another situation we're eating something that tastes bad and we dislike the thing that we're tasting. All of these things are not necessarily suffering, but when viewed from a yeah, I'm tripping myself up here. It's You could kind of say for somebody who is unaware of, you can say yeah, for an unaware mind, all of these things would lead to suffering directly, and it would be essentially a system where someone experiences pain and they suffer, and they experience the lack of pleasure and they suffer. But as you progress along the path that Buddhism lays out, you can essentially separate yourself from these things which would lead to suffering. And while you can still experience cold and hunger, you no longer experience the suffering that comes with these things. Hmm. And yeah, I think I'll finish this video by giving another definition of suffering that I've heard, which rather than being the very sort of the more grounded experience of not having what you love and having what you hate, which I think anybody can look at their own life and see situations where this occurs. There's the more abstract definition where you look at the etymology of the word, because the original word for suffering is a translation of the word dukkha, which I'm obviously no expert about this, but from what I've heard, the du in dukkha is for two, and there's plenty of English words where do means two, like duet or duplicate. But in this context, it kind of suggests a hidden meaning to the word that, on a very abstract level, you could say that the thing that we call suffering is actually a sort of a two-ness of things. You can say like a duality or a separation. And it gets to one of the core ideas in Buddhism that the and not just Buddhism even, like most of spirituality suggests the similar concepts that unification with the world, unification with you say the divine, and that type of thing, leads to uh, basically a more desirable state of being. And it's not something that Buddhism really goes into as much. This idea of union with your surroundings or your environment or the divine, any sort of divine things. Buddhism is much more about um, removing the very root of duality. So rather than finding an escape from duality, an escape from suffering through union with something that is better, that is going to be higher or more purified, it seeks an escape from suffering through the total removal of duality from experience. But yeah, so I think that's about it for this first video. I've kind of jumped around a bit between the different noble truths, but I guess that'll become clear later. But it's very difficult to talk about just the first noble truth because it is a very just plain statement that there is suffering, and the next two are the cause of suffering and the escape from suffering, which I'll obviously go into more detail in. But the noble truths form a sort of a cycle where, in order to understand each one, it's very useful to understand the others. And I think in the interest of describing any of them, it's just very useful to at least bring up the concept of each of the other ones. But yeah, so very quick summary. Suffering, the first noble truth is that suffering exists, and for someone who is not yet liberated, suffering is an undeniable, it's an unavoidable part of life. And to deny it is, as I'll explain in the next video, to deny suffering as a concept is to actually bring yourself more suffering in the future. But suffering can be seen in your life as separation from that which you desire and less separation from that which you don't desire. To have what you hate and to not have what you love. And in a very abstract way, you can say that suffering is the very presence of duality and separateness, and that as long as you see yourself as something separate from your experience, suffering will be, as I said, an unavoidable part of life. But yeah. I'll see you in the next video in the series. Peace.